Hi everyone. In today's presentation, we're gonna see some of the new features that have been developed in the latest version of CSS. The main emphasis will be on animations, but before we get to that, we're gonna see a few new features that we haven't seen yet. We're basically covering the second half of chapter 4 and as well as chapter 11. So, um, CSS has been modularized, meaning that it has been split into modules with this latest version of CSS. Each module can be developed independently of the rest, and this allows not just for existing modules to be leveled independently, but new modules to be created at any time, either defining completely new sets of features or extending the existing features from CSS2. Uh, there have been many modules that have been introduced, I believe about 40 of them. Um, well, the number has nearly doubled since CSS2, and this version of CSS, they say, is constantly in development. I sincerely doubt there's going to be a CSS4. From now on, they're probably going to refer to this tool as just CSS, and it will be continuously improved and maintained. That said, I do need to mention CSS3 is lagging behind the development of HTML5. However, browser developers have introduced many of the CSS3 properties into their browsers. So we have seen the box module, we have seen and talked about selectors. Today we're going to see a little bit more about managing backgrounds and borders. I'm going to see transformations and animations, and I'll show you how to create multiple columns using a new approach, one that we haven't seen yet. With CSS being constantly under development, um, W3C defines certain standards, and browser developers, well, until recently at least, were waging a CSS3 war, if you will, each one of them developing their own syntax for some of the new CSS3 keywords. So for example, here what you can see on this slide is the recommendation from W3C for the border radius property was just border dash radius. Um, Apple and Google were using a prefix dash WebKit dash that you need to add to the property in order for the property to be understood by their browsers, Safari and Chrome. Mozilla was using the dash moz dash prefix in order for Firefox to recognize and process the property. Microsoft was using dash ms dash in order for Internet Explorer to work with the property, and then Opera was using dash o dash. Um, that was the not so distant past. You had to specify a range of keywords for the different browsers in your web page. That still works. You're going to see these on occasion. Um, some of you I know are already using this. It doesn't really hurt to provide um, the code needed by the older browsers in order for your page to work in them. So it's really your choice. I would try and stick to just the W3C name recommendations. Uh, in today's presentation, you're going to see these several times. Um, but like I said, it is your choice to whether you include these in your code or not. Today's browsers are advanced to the point where pretty much all of them recognize just the standard W3C property. In my opinion, you don't really have to worry about the older way of specifying properties. Um, okay, so to future-proof your work, you can include the non-prefix version as your last declaration. So include all the declarations, and then the last one would be the non-prefixed version. But I think again that we're at the point where pretty much all the browsers have moved to the new standards. I did try this with several properties, and In all of my browsers, they work just fine. There was no need for the older version. Okay, so we get to the new features in CSS. This isn't a complete list. I picked the most interesting ones, the most important ones that I thought you'd probably find a good use for. The second half of chapter 4 has a list that's a bit more detailed than this. So please feel free to read that at your convenience. We're going to see some of the features here in the presentation today. So the first one, round corners. Um, the property for this is called border radius. So border dash radius allows you to round the corners of boxes, and the syntax for it is again border radius colon, and you specify a pixel radius. The bigger the value of the radius, the more curvy and larger the rounded corners are going to be. So this is a much simpler approach than what they had in CSS2, where you were supposed to use background images, etc. An example, this is taken from chapter 4, the Lighthouse Bistro website. You can see here that for the heading, we have a styling that has got a border, a blue 1 pixel border, and a border radius of 15 pixels. So all 4 corners have been rounded using this property. For the border radius, you can specify up to 4 values. Okay, you can do just one the way it is here, but you can specify up to 4 values. The 4 values for each radii are given in the order top left. Let me make sure I say this right. Okay, first one is top left, then top right, then bottom right, and then bottom left. So that's the order in which you specify the radii. If bottom left is omitted, it's the same as top right. If bottom right is omitted, it's the same as top left. If top right is omitted, it's the same as top left. Some visual examples of what you can achieve by using the rounded corners property. Alright, next one we look at box and text shadow. Box shadow and text shadow. The box shadow property creates a drop shadow effect. You use 3 lengths and a color. So in this example here, we're using 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 2 pixels, and the color 666, which is some shade of gray. The first value is your horizontal offset, the second value is your vertical offset, and the last one is your blur radius. So to put the shadow on the left and top, you're gonna use negative values for the first 2 offsets. So that is perfectly legal. By using negative values for the first 2 numbers, your shadow is gonna show up over here in the top left corner, around the top left corner. If you use a higher value for the blur radius, your shadow is gonna look more blurred. And text shadow is conceptually identical to box shadow. The only difference is that you are applying the shadow to text rather than a box. Part of the syntax, you can see here that the first 2 arguments there are required. So you got to provide the position of the horizontal and the vertical shadows. All the other values, the blur, the spread, the color, and the inside are optional. Couple more examples here. We defined a box shadow for containers and for wrappers, and the way it's defined is 5 pixels for the vertical and the horizontal shadow, 5 pixels for the blur, and then the color is some shade of gray. I don't know exactly what shade, but since the RGB values are all equal, then this has got to be some shade of gray. And this is again from chapter 4, the Lighthouse Bistro. The wrapper has been defined here in this example with 3 pixels, 3 pixels, 3 pixels, and the color gray. Okay, the next property we look at, opacity. It allows you to configure the opacity of the background color. The range for it is going to go from 0 to 1, 0 being completely transparent and 1 being completely opaque. In the example here, um, we basically tell the browser that all heading 1s need to have a white background color and need to be partially transparent. It's a pretty simple property, but you can achieve some interesting effects with it. Gradients in CSS3. What is a gradient? A gradient is a smooth blending of shades from one color to another. We accomplish that with the help of the background image property. It's the one that we use to specify the background. And there's two kinds of gradients, linear or radial gradients. The linear gradients are going to go from one color to another in a certain direction, left to right, right to left, top bottom, bottom top. You can even do, I believe, diagonal linear gradients. The radial gradients, I think in this picture here, only this one is a radial gradient, um, specifies a center, a shape, and a couple of colors. Normally, you can use more than two colors, but normally it's two colors. And the gradient basically goes from one color to the other using that shape. By default, the shape is an ellipse, and the center is really in the center of the container to which you're applying the gradient. And let me back up here for a second. Let's look at the example again. So in the background image, we specify what kind of gradient this is. We can specify from which end to which end to which end it goes, and then from what color to what color. Okay. Um, I would recommend that you include a fallback option here for browsers that don't support background gradient property. Um, the simple background color or image that you can use specified as a separate rule prior to the background gradient rule in CSS. So that's just in case the browser doesn't recognize gradients. To create multi-color gradients, all you got to do is just specify more than two colors and use the optional parameter in the gradient syntax. So over here, for example, we got two colors. You simply continue this list with as many of these as you like, and that will allow you to go from one color to the next, to the next, to the next, and that's how multiple colors work. In fact, this example right here, the last one, the colorful one, has three colors from what I can see: red, green, and blue. So the way they did that was they had RGB. I mean, the value for red, the value for green, and the value for blue. And that's the effect that you accomplish using a linear approach with those three colors. Okay, the next one is font face. It's pretty much summarized here in this box. It's a way to use web fonts. And there's two steps to it. Again, you can see both of these steps here. So font face allows you to use any licensed TrueType or OpenType font on your web page. First, you have to declare it. So add font face. Then you give it a name here and you specify what the original font is that you have found maybe off of the web somewhere. And then the way you use it is just like you use any other normal font. Okay, so the web font class is going to use, in this example here, we named our font Kaluna, and we're using that in our web page. The alpha channel, I know you are already familiar with it. What it allows you to do in CSS is it provides a transparency channel. So RGBA lets you specify a normal RGB color and a value for the transparency. An example down here, we're using red, green, and there's a syntax error. I'm sorry about this. So red, green, blue, and the value for alpha. There's got to be 4 values in there. And the alpha value is going to go from 0 to 1, where 0 is fully transparent and 1 is fully opaque. Um, I guess I should mention the big difference between the alpha channel and the opacity property that we saw earlier, is that um, this property it's not inherited, so it's just applied to the background color and not to text. Ultimately, this leads to simpler and easier to maintain code and more creative possibilities. Multi-column layout. We have um, pretty much exhausted this topic when it came to using the properties for floating positions. So floating allowed you to create multiple columns. It turns out there's other ways to do this. One more way in CSS3 of doing this is with the help of the column count. Okay, so it allows you to split the text newspaper-like across multiple columns. Um, it's expressed in terms of number of columns, and then you can tweak some of the sub-properties, like for example the width of each column and the gap between the columns. But you always got to start with the column count. So you have to tell CSS3, you have to tell the browser how many columns you want your container to be split into, and then you can tweak some of the additional properties, like um, what the width for each column should be and what the gap between the columns should be. Now, these are not going to be enforced strictly. The browser is just going to do its best to do what you're asking it to do. Okay, in certain cases it just may not be possible. So the results are going to vary from browser to browser. Okay. All right. Let's stop here for a minute, and in a moment we will continue with animations.